Greg Peterson here, and I want to thank you for listening to the Urban Farm Podcast. We wouldn't be able to keep doing these great shows without you. So as a token of my appreciation, I'd like to offer you access to a list of our top 10 episodes I personally find most inspiring. If you enjoy the Urban Farm Podcast but don't have time to listen to every one, then you will love this list. Although all our guests have great information to offer, if you are short on time, these 10 are must-listens. To get access to the top 10 most inspiring podcast episodes, text FARMER to 44222. That's FARMER to 44222. And enjoy listening.
You're listening to the Urban Farm Podcast, your partner in the Grow Your Own Food revolution. Whether you've just been introduced to urban farming or you're a lifelong advocate, we're sure you'll leave feeling more informed, equipped, and empowered to dig deeper into the soil of your local food economy. With you every step of the way, here's your host, Greg Peterson.
Today on the Urban Farm Podcast, we have Kanin Routson to talk about his experience with apple tree diversity. Kanin has devoted his life to heritage apple tree diversity. In the pursuit of apple knowledge, Kanin has researched apple varieties from historic homesteads across Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Utah. During his research, he documented 34 known apple varieties and 110 unique apple trees of unknown origin. He has collected and propagated unique varieties of heritage trees from numerous small homestead orchards in northern Arizona, as well as Capital Reef National Park and the historic Philmont Scout Ranch and Chase Ranches in New Mexico. This research and further research on wild apple genetic diversity has led Kanin to complete a master's degree at Northern Arizona University and a PhD, congratulations, at the University of Arizona. Kanin's most recent project is co-founding Arizona Cider, a local hard cider company based out of Prescott, Arizona. This project involves all steps of the cider production process, including the pressing, fermentation, aging, and blending of the cider, as well as propagation of unique Southwest heritage apple trees and over 100 French, English, German, and American varieties of apples. Arizona Cider will have cider available in the spring of 2018. Welcome to the show today, Kanin.
Hello, I am excited to be here.
And I am excited to have you, given my fruit tree background. So I shared a bit about you. Can you fill in the blanks for us and share more about the path you took to get where you're at now?
Certainly. I was homeschooled growing up, and I grew up on a small farm in rural Arizona, about 30 miles north of Prescott, Arizona. And in that area, my parents, like I said, they had a small farm, and we grew a number of different fruit crops, but we were in a very cold valley, and we had late spring freezing issues. So we would get apples and peaches and plums once every, apples maybe 2 or 3 years, and peaches, I think, twice when I was growing up.
Wow.
And they were a huge treat. And so because of that, I started, from a pretty early age, being very aware of the old homestead fruit tree apple orchards in the area that might be in microclimates that would have fruit when our parents didn't have fruit. So I think that really put me on the track at a pretty early age of being interested in apples and fruit crops. And yes, from there pretty much went through undergraduate degrees, and during that at Prescott College was studying the historic apple trees of the Prescott Southwest area. And about what I was able to do there was preserve them through grafting them onto young rootstock to preserve the varieties.
Nice.
And then for my master's degree, I got to thinking, okay, I know that there's a bunch of historic trees growing around, but what I don't know is, are those 20th century Red Delicious, Golden Delicious, Jonathan, 20th century heirloom apples that are still widely available, or am I actually grafting and preserving unique Southwest apple varieties? And so I looked into and figured out how to use genetic fingerprinting, and we can talk about that later.
Oh yes, we will.
Okay, as to identify these old historic trees. And then I was still interested in apples, so I decided to get my PhD.
Wow.
But my professors couldn't couldn't come up with what they call a PhD level question for historic apples. So that's when I branched out from studying just Southwest apples into studying the broader genetics in apples. I was looking at wild apples and population genetics in a native apple species. And that was the Pacific crabapple, which grows California, Oregon, Washington, and the coast.
Oh, interesting. Interesting.
So,
and that grows wild.
It's a native apple, and it's about the size of a pea. The fruit are very, very tiny.
Yeah.
And they're very, very tart. The Native Americans use them quite widely, but they would let them over-ripen in a process that in persimmons and medlars and some other fruits is called bletting, where they over-ripen and then they become a jam, essentially, a fruit jam on the tree.
Oh, interesting, interesting. So I have an interesting question for you.
Okay.
This person that we know of as Johnny Appleseed was a real person, correct?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so my question kind of revolves around that. We have a tremendous apple diversity in this country.
Yes.
Is there a connection?
There is a connection. And the connection, I guess the connection is, don't think of Johnny Appleseed as one person, although he was one person. But he was one person of a nation of people. And this, essentially, there are 4 native apples in the United States, in North America. And they're all very small crab apples. There's 3 eastern ones. So I'm going pretty far back here, but I will tie it back around. There's Balis fusca on the west coast, and then there's Coronaria ioanensis, and, well, I'm not going to remember the other one.
That's all right.
But anyway, they're native apples that are very small, and they're used by Native Americans, but they weren't what we consider eating apples. All of the apples that we consider eating apples were brought to the New World by pioneers, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
Yes. And those mostly English at the time, but also French, Spanish, etc., apples were not well adapted to the New World. And I'm finding that, which we can get to later, in my grafting of cider apple trees. A lot of those European varieties do not do very well here. And so people brought these apple trees here, and the original trees may not have done very well, but they were planting many, many seeds. And that was, another mechanism of, we can't just fly. You could not fly across the ocean back then. You had to take a ship for months and months.
Exactly, right.
So bringing a tree was very costly and expensive, and bringing apple seeds was very cheap. So you had, from A, the trees were not well adapted, B, getting the trees here was difficult. You had a lot of seedling apples being planted. And then we also had that in the Homesteading Act, and there were, I'm sure, many versions of that, but at one period in time, to homestead a tract of land in the West or Midwest at the time, homesteaders were required to plant an orchard. It's one of the mechanisms of proving history, proving history of their ownership of the land so they could get title to it.
Right, exactly.
And there was talk about somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 apple or pear trees to create this orchard. And most homesteaders were not wealthy people. They could not afford to buy 50 grafted apple trees, but they could afford to plant 50 seeds or hundreds of seeds, and that's where Johnny Appleseed comes in. He was moving to those new towns where people needed orchards and they needed apple trees, and he was taking the seeds, the pomace is what it's called when you have a press to press juice from apples. Right. The leftover pressings is called pomace, and that is a mixture of apple pulp and apple seeds. And that that's where most of the apple seeds in the early times would have come from, is from these cider mills.
Got it.
So most of these apple seedlings were not going to be necessarily delicious eating apples like you and I think of when we think of store-bought apples, but were probably a more primitive form of apple that a good friend of mine, Tom Burford, is an apple researcher on the East Coast, and he refers to them as spitters. And spitters are exactly what it sounds like. You bite into this roadside seedling apple, and you're going to spit it right back out because it's either not very sweet or extremely acidic or tastes very bland. Yeah. So they weren't planting them for eating. They were planting them for land ownership, and they were planting them for cider. Cider was a big deal in this country in the early homesteading period because access to fresh water was hard to come by. And And there was a lot of, I guess, before we had our modern sewer systems and our modern water treatment facilities, water could be a very contaminated source, and drinking a slightly alcoholic cider would be a
safe way to go.
Safe way to go, and maybe a good way to go. I don't know. Maybe people were feeling pretty good back then.
So the genetic diversity came from planting all these different seeds from the pomace and coming up with just this genetic roulette, essentially, of all kinds of apples. Precisely.
So apples have what's referred to as forced outcrossing. They're to get a slightly technical term here, they have what's called high heterozygosity, and that's very similar to humans. They can't pollinate themselves, so they have to pollinate with other people. They have, other apples. They have what's called a self-incompatibility gene, where an apple flower cannot pollinate itself. So that forces every single seed is going to be a different, unique variety.
Right.
And so when you're planting, in the case of this country, tens of millions of apple seeds, from that, you're going to have just an incredible diversity of apples coming out of that.
Cool. So before we jump into the Southwest, I want to know, what is one cool apple story from pioneer times forward?
How about the Rhode Island greening apple? That's a very interesting apple.
Okay, go.
It came out of Rhode Island in, we're going to have to Google the exact time period. But
that's okay.
Okay. Early 1800s.
Okay.
And it was identified as this, in somebody's yard, this seedling apple variety that just tasted wonderful and was quickly spread around the Rhode Island area, and then became, I guess, widely popular throughout the nation. And what is it now, 200 years later, probably, I'm still finding Rhode Island greening apples in historic homesteads here in the Southwest.
In the Southwest?
Yes. And it's a what's called a triploid apple. It's a genetic term. It has a second set of chromosomes attached in the genetics. So it's self-compatible and produces sterile pollen. So it means it's not a good pollinating apple.
Right.
But
exactly.
for some reason, triploid apples produce larger fruit than normal and more, I don't know, desirable fruit? I'm not sure what the term is there, but they're pretty tart. They're an excellent cooking apple. And still, when you find them in historic orchards, you're like, wow, this is a really good apple. I bet it's a...
Now, were they grafted back then? They had to have been grafted back then.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Grafting has been around since the Roman times. It's been around a very long time.
Oh, interesting. So one of these days, I'm going to have you back to the show to talk about that. Because with your list of things that we can talk about today, we won't get to that, and I'd really like to know about grafting.
Okay, excellent.
So history of apple cultivation in the Southwest, obviously they were done for cider mills, right?
Yes.
And how do these historic orchards in the Southwest reflect history around here? Okay,
so the Southwest has a slightly different story than the Johnny Appleseed story.
Okay.
Although the Johnny Appleseed story ties into it.
Uh-huh.
The Southwest, we really have, I guess the Spanish were the big influence in the Southwest from a very early time period.
Right.
So here in the Southwest, we had, Apache wars. We had just very harsh conditions for settlers to establish. But we had as early as 1629, I believe, this Franciscan missionary named Alonso de I'm going to butcher his name, Benavides. Alonso de Benavides was writing from New Mexico and talking about the introduction of peaches, apricots, plums, and I believe even apples at that point.
Wow.
And those would have come from Spain, probably through the Canary Islands, across to Mexico City and up the Camino Real in the early 1600s, many hundreds of years before we had Western settlement from the East Coast.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll have another quote here, and this is from, I'm going to butcher his name also, Josiah Gregg. In 1830, he was a botanical explorer and merchant. And he was passing through Santa Fe, New Mexico in 1830, and he quotes, "The settlements were very thickly interspersed with vineyards and cornfields. The orchards were planted with apples, peaches, and apricots, and all seedlings, and all wretchedly poor, though the grapes from Spain were delicious." And so that's talking about seedling apples and seedling fruit trees in the Southwest very early before, I guess, genetic material or fruit trees would have been brought across, say, on the Santa Fe Trail.
So you said seedlings. That means not grafted.
That means not grafted, yes. So those would have been apple seeds brought from Mexico City or even Spain up the Santa Fe Trail and then traded out, either planted in Hispanic villages or traded out to the Native Americans.
Interesting. All right, cool.
Yeah, and then by the mid 19th century, we had the Santa Fe Trail opening up corridor into the Southwest, and you have a lot of settlement from the East Coast coming out here, bringing with them, the Johnny Appleseed story, and we're kind of on the fringes of that.
Yeah,
I would say that a lot of the varieties that I find in historic orchards probably were not seedlings from that time period. They're probably more grafted trees coming out of this melting pot of apple diversity from the Midwest. So we're very much on the fringe of that, but these orchards still tell that story.
Interesting.
And then later on, and there was a pretty still widely known nursery called Stark Brothers Trees. But they were very, very popular in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. And
so this is late 1800s then.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Up into the 1930s, 1940s, that time period, Stark Brothers had an incredible influence in the Southwest. And that is in part because one of the Stark brothers, and I don't know their names, but I believe it was Clarence Stark. Anyway, he had a respiratory issue where he was told by his doctor to move out to the dry climes of the West.
Right.
And I think they were based out of Denver. Don't quote me on these exact things, but anyway, they became an influence in the Southwest and marketing, grafted fruit trees into the Southwest. So a lot of the heritage orchards from the 1930s, 1920s, and 1940s, jumping around a little bit there, but those would have been a good chance those were Stark Brothers trees.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And they're still around, obviously.
Yes, both these historic orchards and Stark Brothers. They're all still around.
So differences between primitive orchards, kitchen garden orchards, and commercial orchards. I wouldn't even have thought to have asked that question. So you sent that one over. Tell me about that.
Yes. Okay. So primitive orchards really refer to the early American homestead orchards. And those would have been seedling trees. Those would have been Johnny Appleseed type orchards.
Right.
And you can tell them because they grazed livestock under these trees. And what that means is that they had a different pruning style. And I'll explain the differences. But in a modern orchard, or even, a modern any kind of orchard, the limbs usually start at about 3 feet or less off the ground.
Oh, right.
Where you start branching your limbs.
Right.
So if you have livestock in those orchards, in which everybody had livestock in their orchards, you could not start your limbs that low because the livestock rubbed them off. You really don't see limbs starting until about 6 feet off the ground.
Right.
And they're full standard, big, giant, mature trees, and probably seedling. Although some of the later ones were grafted. And then kitchen garden orchards are what we would refer to now as the backyard orchard. When you had a homestead, or let's say a homestead, you would have the kitchen garden, which would supply the family, the house, with fresh fruit and vegetables. And then you would have your cider orchard, which would be a much larger orchard of probably seedling trees out in the field. But as we discussed, seedling apples are generally bad for fresh eating. And so around the homestead or around the house, you would have a smaller orchard of specialty varieties that they treated the trees much better than they treated their cider orchard. And they probably paid a lot more money for them. And they also would have a diversity of apples in those orchards because many of these homesteads predate modern electricity and modern cold storage, and they could not go to the nearest grocery store to get an apple from Chile. They had to grow their own fruit. So there are what are called summer apples, and those are apples that ripen incredibly early in the summer. And then most of the apples that we know of are standard fall apples. They ripen anywhere from August to maybe mid-October. And there are winter apples. And winter apples are very dense, very hard apples that won't ripen until November or later.
Right.
But they will keep until spring of the next year. So between your summer apples, your fall apples, and your winter apples, you could have apples pretty much year round from one homestead. And then they had different uses for apples. So you have your fresh eating apples, and you also have your cooking apples, and you have your drying apples, and you have your, an apple specific for apple pie, or you have a specific cider apple. So these kitchen garden orchards, I guess, are incredibly diverse and incredible sources of agricultural, or apple in this case, diversity. And then you get into your commercial orchard. Yeah. And I'm sure, I would hope that everybody has a pretty good idea of what happens in commercial situations. But the basic premise is that for commercial production, apples your entire apple orchard pretty much has to ripen at a very uniform time. So you can, for the economy of picking it. Right. And then the apple has to be able to withstand getting from the orchard to cold storage and then eventually to market. And it has to, there's a whole lot of physical abuse, you could say, I guess, that the apple will go through between harvest and sale in the market. And it has to look very pretty at the market. So if there were 100,000 apples that were delicious to eat in 1890, there's just a very, very small handful of those apples that met the criteria of ripening uniformly, withstanding shipping, still looking pretty at the store. Yeah. And as I said, or in the last things that I said, none of that was how the apple tastes. Right. Because people buy the apple and then find out that it might not be the best apple, but at that point they've already got it. So yeah, exactly. How an apple tasted didn't really fall into that.
So we have this with Johnny Appleseed and we have this tremendous diversity in apple varieties. Why do we want such a high diversity? Well, you can answer that question from a variety of different angles. And probably one of the biggest ones would be the reason we want genetic variation is for disease issues and climate variability. Mm-hmm. If we have one apple planted over the entire world, and we're not quite that bad, we have 11 apples accounting for 90% of commercial apple production. Wow. Those 11 apple varieties are pretty much all interrelated to each other. Yeah. What if you get one disease, one insect, pest, whatever, that figures out how to eat that apple, then you're looking at the entire world apple supply being at risk. If for some reason we have something called climate variability or increasing climate variability, maybe man-made caused, maybe not, right? But probably man-made caused. Yeah. Anyway, that you could see some slight climate shifts that make it our standard 11 apple varieties not very resilient anymore. I like that word, resilient. Yeah. To our future climate conditions. So in the world of wild apples, there is so much genetic variability that we hope has the ability to adapt to future climate variabilities and disease issues. From a social perspective, the apple is just so much more than what you can find in the store. There are really absolutely amazing apple varieties that you would never be able to encounter in the store just because they don't ship very well. Right. And they might not look beautiful. They might look pretty ugly. There's an apple known as the knobby russet so russeting, as in russet potatoes, is kind of it's a rough texture on the surface. And apples can get that rough texture. Uh-huh. And the knobby russet is supposedly, I've not actually tried it yet. I have some growing, but they're not quite old enough to produce a incredibly misshapen apple that's very russeted on the surface, very rough and misshapen, but it's supposedly delicious. So you would never probably sell that at the store, and so you'd never have commercial growers growing that. Right. Cool. So you had mentioned something in the intro about DNA and using DNA to identify apple varieties, and that kind of piqued my interest. So I want to kind of know about that.
Okay. So there are, I guess, backing up a step, in the time period that I was interested in my research for the historic orchards in the Southwest, say the mid to late 19th century, mid to late 1800s up to about 1950, there were literally thousands, reports of up to 14,000 apple varieties being grown in the United States during that time period.
Wow.
And
that's epic.
It's epic.
That's
and
epic.
If you think about apple varieties, okay, you've got round, you've got, elliptical and various shapes, rough shapes between round and cylindrical. And you've got a color range from yellow to red to green to very dark red, almost black. But there's just a finite variation that an apple will take physically. And so trying to identify an apple using old reference books, William Henry Reagan wrote one of the classic ones, Nomenclature of the Apple in 1930. And it's literally it looks like an Excel spreadsheet, although it predated Excel spreadsheets. And that gives a name of an apple, a whole list of apples and a very small amount of information. And it might be a round green apple that's late ripening. And there might be 200 or 300 apples that meet that description. So
at least.
At least, exactly. So trying to identify apples using nomenclature is pretty challenging. It's something that I have not figured out how to do. Now, there are apple experts in the country, John Bunker being a great one up in Maine and Fedco Trees, who can take an apple and pretty quickly classify it into probables and possibles. And if it's a modern or standard historic variety, he can identify it, like with the snap of a fingers. He knows it. He knows it cold. But me coming from an area in the Southwest where I was not actually exposed to that many varieties growing up, and our homestead trees, I didn't know the names of them. I cannot do that. Right. And I imagine most people cannot do that. So I took a more of a scientific approach, and that is using DNA. And so DNA, I guess it's very similar to forensic DNA, where you're trying to identify, pretty much it takes forever to sequence the entire genome, and it's very expensive. But you don't need to do that to be able to differentiate between individuals. You just need to look at very specific sections of the genome and then compare those same genes, I guess, between individuals. And because of heterozygosity, you will inherit certain genes from your mom and certain genes from your dad, or an apple tree is the exact same way, certain genes from the pollen and certain genes from the mother, and those genes will be essentially passed on in certain patterns that you can look at. What I did is basically took apple leaves and ground them up to extract the DNA, and then ran them through what's called PCR, and that amplifies when you put a primer in to look at a certain section of the genome, that will amplify that gene. And I did that through what are called microsatellites. And that's a technical term, I guess, but it's essentially a way to create a genetic fingerprint. And then you run those out on a gel, or I was using gel back in the day. This is in 2009, I did the study.
Back in the day, he said. Back
in the day. Things have progressed light years, I'm sure, since then. But we were still running them out on gels back then. And basically, you're just, at each gene, you're recording whether the apple has 100 base pairs at that gene location or 182. So a slightly different gene at that location. And you record for the 7 genes that I was looking at, and they'll be both, if it's diploid, it'll have 2 sets of chromosomes. So you're looking at 14 possible genes. You're just comparing one individual to another. And I went through Stark Brothers nursery catalogs, and I went through the USDA also had agriculture experiment stations in the Southwest, kind of in the time period I was interested in, where they were introducing apple varieties for testing. And so I found those from the lists of varieties that they introduced, and from Stark Brothers catalogs, they came up with a list of known varieties that should have been introduced to the Southwest. Found those varieties, ground up leaves from their DNA, or whatever, ground up their leaves, extracted DNA, and then had a reference library, essentially, of genetic fingerprints of known varieties. And then I could compare the unknown fingerprints to the known fingerprints. And from that,
you get genetic markers.
Yep.
Ah, cool.
Yeah. And
Excellent.
yes. And I just want to briefly say that was done at the USDA National Center for Genetic Resources Preservation in Fort Collins, Colorado. I didn't have the genetic resources to do it myself. So it was done in a big lab with the help of some scientists that do that type of work.
Well, cool. This is one of the reasons that I've got my master's, and I've always wanted to go back and get my PhD so I can, probably not do what you did or anything close to what you did, but, dig in. That's what I loved about my master's degree is I got to dig in and study one thing.
Yes.
So that's maybe one day I'll go back and get a PhD. Why are apples essential trees for our urban farms?
Well, I guess that's a theoretical question, but I will be happy to argue it.
Of course, you have a PhD. This is what we do.
I can see arguing either side of that question, but I definitely like apples. And I guess I feel that apples are a very rich source of enjoyment and a source of food. And they're very iconic to our American culture and really a lot of cultures around the world, but specifically here in America. So they're an excellent source of food. They're an excellent source of beverages.
Oh, yeah.
If you like apple cider or fresh or hard.
So they're widely diverse in what we can do with them.
And they're widely diverse. They grow apples from the tropical regions all the way up to Fairbanks, Alaska. So,
cool.
Siberia.
Cool.
So we can grow them almost anywhere.
And they stay on the tree a long time, don't they?
They do. And that's a little bit varietal specific. There are certain apples that will be on the tree till next year and certain apples that will fall pretty quickly. But depending on your variety, yes, they're very versatile.
Wow, cool. So you've started this project called Arizona Cider.
Yes.
Why? And what's the process? What's your timeline? What's your process? What's that look like? Because I would like to be there on opening day when we get to take our first sip of the cider in the spring of 2018. So,
okay, absolutely. I hope you are there. So pretty much I've been interested in apples for a very, very, very long time. And I've been researching apples for a very, very, very long time. And then I graduated and needed a real job. And I don't know if you could call my job a real job. I work as a biological research scientist, but it's very far from apples. And so I'm trying to get back into having apples a bigger part of my life. Like in academia, apples were central. And for my work right now, apples are the farthest thing from central. I'm chasing desert tortoises around the Mojave Desert or looking for rare plants in the mountains. And so I feel that cider is a growing industry, and I feel that it is a way that farmers can potentially make money through as a value-added product for apple trees. Yeah. And that's what we're experimenting doing. And the basic process is I have a bunch of historic trees that I've been planting every year since I started my senior project at Prescott College, and then for sure during my master's. And so I have a lot of trees that are from 10 years old down to maybe 2 years old, all heritage Southwest apple varieties. And I've also been recently collecting, as you said in the intro, French, English, and American cider apple varieties that are specific cider apple varieties. And that's, if you think of wine as an analogy, there are table grapes and there are wine grapes. And table grapes are great for eating. They're crisp and they're full of sugar, but they don't have a lot of polyphenols and they don't have a lot of tannin, both of which are essential in making a very good beverage. And wine grapes are very high in polyphenols and tannins. And the same thing, fresh eating apples are pretty low. They're high in sugar, but low in interesting compounds. Like once you ferment apple juice out to alcohol, the yeast eats all of the sugar. And so you're left with whatever is left in the apple. And if it's a cider apple, you have polyphenols, you have tannins, much higher acidity than the standard eating apple. And so you have complexity. And so we're growing these apples. And then the next step, I guess, is to press the juice out of them and pitch yeast on them. There are a lot of historically they used wild yeast. They just press the juice and let nature happen.
Right.
And the problem with doing that is you can sometimes end up with a beverage that's not wonderful. That's a long way from being even drinkable.
Right.
And if we're trying to make, a product that people will love, and especially in today's day and age where we have a pretty high standard of what a good beverage is, then we're using commercial wine yeast is actually what we're using. It'll be very similar to a white wine making process where we're controlling temperature, and high temperature promotes bacteria growth, and bacteria growth is vinegar and lactic acid bacteria, which are great in fermented foods, but they produce lactic acid, not alcohol. So,
yeah.
We don't want them in cider. We want yeast in cider.
Exactly.
And so we're controlling the apple varieties, trying to get very interesting crab apple type things, cider apple type things, and then heritage apples to get interesting juice. We're pitching them with wine yeasts that will produce hopefully good flavors. And we're controlling the temperature to around 55 degrees, and that will promote the yeast and reduce the bacteria. And yeast at cold temperatures will produce a lot of your fruity esters is what they're called, but they're like the fruity flavors when you drink a white wine or a cider. Most of those come from the yeast. Some of them in the apple, most of the yeast.
Yeah. And
most of those are produced at a cooler temperature. So fermentation is a science and an art.
Oh yeah.
And then you will have, so fermentation typically takes around 3 weeks, possibly plus or minus. And then there'll be what's called a maturation period where you think of red wine as
aging, yes.
Aging, and that allows flavors to mellow and develop. And you have, when really green cider is what it's called, when it's pretty much straight fermented 3 weeks into it, it tastes very yeasty. And so the yeasty flavors will mellow and disappear, and you'll have more of the fruity aromas coming out. So
curious.
Yes. So that's kind of our cider making process up till, bottling and then selling. Right now we're working on our website and our business and all those things that we didn't learn about in academia because we were scientists. And when I say we, it's my brother and I doing this project. So.
Nice. So it just occurred to me, if you're going to have cider in the spring of 18, that's a year from now. That means you're growing the apples. So your apple crop from 2017 is going to make that, right?
Yes. And, I don't have enough. Depends on how much cider we'll be able to make. I'm not going to be able to grow all of the apples that that we'll want for our cider. And so we'll probably be knocking on doors with everybody with apple orchards hoping to pick apples.
Yeah, exactly.
And if we don't get enough there, then we're going to be looking at Wilcox probably to some of the larger commercial growers.
There's still Arizona. How many pounds of apples do you imagine you're going to grow this year?
That's a good question. We didn't measure them last year. We ended up with 50 gallons of apple juice, and
wow.
If it's 2.5 gallons per bushel, and a bushel is 40 pounds, I'm not going to be able to do the math in my head. But
I was just curious.
I'm hoping to get 500 or so 100 pounds of apples probably off my trees this year. And
nice. Are you excited?
Oh, I'm very excited.
This is like an epic moment when you're actually to the point, because when you said spring of 18 seems so far away. And
it does.
And we're going to sneeze and it'll be here, right?
Right.
It seems so far away, but then when I started thinking about it, hold on. I started doing the kind of the stepping back from it, and it's like, oh, those are the apples you're going to grow this spring and summer and fall.
Right, exactly. And we are quickly getting our space is pretty much ready. It's on our parents' farm, and it's a farm kitchen that we've got up to county health code levels. And
nice.
We're still working. The county we're still working on our permitting process. We have our federal license, and we.
Oh, right. You need a federal license for the alcohol, right?
You do, and you need a state license, and our state license will depend on the county. So we're just waiting to get all the hearing and the zoning and all that stuff.
So I want you back in a year to talk specifically about this. Once we're ready to taste apple cider, maybe I'll bring our equipment up there and we'll just sit up there and drink apple cider and have this conversation.
And that would be really, really fun. And I'd be stoked to have you on. Yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, I'm going to shift on you, and I want you to talk about a time you failed, how you overcame that failure, and what you might have learned from it.
Okay. I guess I'm going to answer this with two things, and they're not so much epic life failures, but
That's all right.
They were learning experiences for sure. And one of them is learning how to graft was a huge challenge for me. And it took me a long time trying to learn on myself. I made maybe 2 or 3 successful grafts. And this was probably during my teenage years. And then when I was during my senior project at Prescott College, we actually found this very old man named Tom Devupovich, who's since passed away, but he had a master's in horticulture from the Ukraine or Yugoslavia or somewhere.
Oh my gosh.
Somewhere back there.
The old country.
Yep. And his claim to fame was that he could graft 1,000 apple trees in a day.
Holy shamoles.
Okay. He knows how to graft.
Yeah, no kidding.
And he taught us how to graft. And so it was kind of like I was unsuccessful before he taught us and successful after. And it was pretty much just in the technique, the sharp, clean tools. And
yep.
Yeah. So I don't know what I wasn't doing right before, but.
Wow.
And the other thing is being mostly self-taught with my orcharding. A lot of my young trees early on, I had what was called an M7 rootstock, which is a semi-dwarf, very standard commercial rootstock, but it wasn't entirely self-supporting, and I didn't know that. And
so it wouldn't hold the trees up? Is that what the deal was?
Yes. So dwarfing rootstocks control so very briefly, you have full-size trees, which are grown from seed, which are large 20-foot tall trees.
Right. And
then all the way down to dwarf trees. And what controls the height in an apple tree is the rootstock. Mm-hmm. And the rootstock is either very vigorous, like a standard size tree, or very compact, non-vigorous.
Yeah.
This root system will not support a large tree, so a large tree doesn't grow. But those dwarfing trees often are not self-supporting. So if you don't stake them, they will fall over.
Oh,
and so I didn't stake my trees. They were semi-dwarf, and a lot of them kind of are pretty leaning.
Fell over.
And they're still that way, and they'll be that way for the rest of their lives.
Yeah.
So that's something that reminds me every time I'm in the orchard. It's like, oh, right.
Nice. Well, this is why I asked that question, because this is, it's just a learning process. Life is a learning process, and when we fail, those are opportunities to learn.
Yeah. In the case of leaning apple trees, they remind me every day.
Yeah, exactly. So what do you consider your biggest success?
Well, I have a couple of those, and one of them is learning how to graft was probably one of my biggest successes in preserving apple diversity or in preserving historic trees. Like without grafting, I couldn't do a lot. And then once I did learn how to graft, it basically opened a huge door for me and for anybody. When I'm buying trees from a nursery at $20 or $30 a piece, when rootstock is available for, right, depends on how many you buy, but in the neighborhood of 60 cents to $1.20 a piece, the affordability of growing trees and the ability to grow whatever I want to basically increased exponentially at that point. And the second one I would say is probably my network. And that for me in terms of accessing varieties, in terms of learning how, in this case, to make cider or how to propagate trees. Pretty much I've learned everything through knowing people and asking people.
Yeah.
So I guess my network is probably
perfect case in point is your friend from the old country that taught you how to graft.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah. I had a very, very wonderful mentor. He was 60 years my senior that I learned a lot from, and I can't say enough about having great mentors. Yay. So what drives you?
Well, I'm very passionate about a whole lot of different subjects in the world. Mm-hmm. And my to-do list is probably longer than my life is long.
Yeah, I got one of those, understand.
And so I think in combination with, I try to focus on taking really good care of my health, eating very clean, very healthy foods, and exercising. So I have pretty good high energy level. Yeah. So I guess that in combination with wanting to do a whole lot of things in life is probably the sum total of that question. Yeah.
Cool. So I'm all about education, and I have to know, is there a book that has been influential for you in this process in your life?
Sure. there's been probably hundreds of books, and I'm going to actually even just cite a chapter, and that is Michael Pollan from 2002, The Botany of Desire.
Oh my God.
There's
the chapter on apples.
The chapter on apples was incredibly influential in my work. Yes.
Uh-huh. Is that the one you were going to call out?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And another one that was, I'm also going to cite The Man Who Planted Trees.
Oh my God, of course.
By Gene Giano in 1953.
Yeah.
That was kind of pretty much a childhood hero, and then I was pretty heartbroken when I figured out it was not a true story.
Oh.
But it's still very worth reading, that story.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So what one final piece of advice do you have for our listeners?
Well, I think that people should plant trees.
I wholeheartedly agree on that one.
I would say learn how to propagate your own trees. Not all trees need grafting, but it just, if you learn some simple techniques in propagating trees, it really opens up your opportunities and your ability to preserve agricultural diversity. Yeah. So become a fruit explorer. That's one of my favorite things, is going out to historic orchards or going out to other people's orchards, and just in the fall when there's fruit on the trees, and just tasting what is available, what exists out there.
Yeah.
And then having the ability to take, to repropagate that to my own farm and my own orchard is pretty awesome. And I highly recommend other people do that.
Yay. Well, thank you so much for joining us on the show and sharing your experience with us today, Kanin. It has been a treat getting to chat with you.
Likewise, this has been a fun talk.
Nice. So how can our listeners get a hold of you?
Well, in the future, there will be ArizonaCider.com.
Uh-huh.
and probably social media, but we haven't quite gotten there yet. So probably the easiest way is through email, and that would be my first and last names @gmail.com, all scrunched together.
Got it.
Yeah.
Perfect. And you can find show notes from today's podcast at urbanfarm.org/AZ Cider. Well, that's it for today. Thanks for joining us on the Urban Farm Podcast. Greg Peterson here, and I want to thank you for listening to the Urban Farm Podcast. We wouldn't be able to keep doing these great shows without you. So as a token of my appreciation, I'd like to offer you access to a list of our top 10 episodes I personally find most inspiring. If you enjoy the Urban Farm Podcast but don't have time to listen to every one, then you will love this list. Although all our guests have great information to offer, if you are short on time, these 10 are must-listens. To get access to the top 10 most inspiring podcast episodes, text FARMER to 44222. That's FARMER to 44222. And enjoy listening.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Urban Farm Podcast. Remember to listen 3 days a week for tips, advice, and resources to help you on your journey with urban farming. You can find us on the web at urbanfarm.org or send us an email to podcast@urbanfarm.org. In the words of Vincent van Gogh, great things are done by a series of small things brought together. Be encouraged that with each lesson learned and skill developed, you are one step closer in the direction of your dreams.